The mother, who's a flamboyant California biker with an affinity for who bravely raises her little son Rocky, a little boy with a rare disease that eventually distorts his face into a cruel mask of deformity.
She was paid $15,000 for a story that made a Hollywood studio nearly $50 million. She watched an actress win awards for playing a softened, sanitized version of her own life. And decades later, in the quiet years before her own death, the real mother behind the movie Mask said things about her son, her choices, and that film that most people never heard, because most people never bothered to look past the poster. This is the real story of Rocky Dennis and the woman who raised him, and it is stranger, harder, and more human than anything that made it onto a movie screen. Roy Lee Dennis was born on December 4, 1961, in Glendora, California, the son of Florence Rusty Tullis and her second husband, Roy Dennis. Everyone called him Rocky, because as an infant he wouldn't settle unless someone rocked him. For his first 2 years, nothing about him looked unusual. He was just a baby, then a toddler, healthy enough by all appearances. Then, around age 2, a routine visit turned into something else entirely. An X-ray technician noticed something wrong in the shape of his skull. That single observation set off a cascade of testing at Ucla Medical Center, and eventually a diagnosis that had almost no precedent to compare it to: craniodiphyseal dysplasia, an extraordinarily rare bone disorder, sometimes called Lionitis, that causes calcium to build up abnormally across the skull. The bone doesn't just thicken. It grows, pushes, and distorts, gradually crushing the space meant for the brain, the eyes, the ears, the nerves that let a person see, hear, and simply function. At the time, doctors believed only a small handful of cases had ever been documented anywhere in the world. The prognosis Rusty was given was blunt and devastating. Her son would likely go blind. He would probably suffer intellectual disability as the pressure on his brain increased. And in all likelihood, he would not live past the age of 7. What happened next is the part of the story that actually matters, more than any statistic about disease rarity. Rusty Tullis did not accept the prognosis as a script to follow. She pushed back against doctors who assumed Rocky's failing eyesight meant he couldn't be taught to read. She pushed back against schools that wanted to move him out of ordinary classrooms and into separate ones. She insisted, repeatedly, that his mind was sharp, and that the discomfort other people felt around his appearance said far more about them than it did about him. And Rocky backed her up by simply living the way any bright, funny kid would live. He became a strong student. He was voted things like best buddy and most good-natured by his classmates. He tutored other students for money and negotiated his own rate. He fell in love at summer camp with a girl who was blind, so their entire relationship began without either of them judging the other by appearance. When a doctor once offered him surgery that could reshape his face, Rocky reportedly turned the offer down, asking who exactly he would see in the mirror if his face were changed. He had decided, on his own terms, to keep the one he had. To understand why Rusty raised him the way she did, you have to understand who Rusty actually was before any of this happened, because the movie only gave you a polished sliver of her. She was born Florence Steinberg in Brooklyn, New York, in 1936, the daughter of a truck driver. She was Jewish, blunt, and clearly not built for a conventional path. She was expelled from junior high for truancy in her early teens. Not long after, she was riding with motorcycle gangs and working as a dancer at Coney Island while she was still a teenager herself. She married young, had her first son, Joshua, and then that marriage ended. Eventually she married Roy Dennis and moved to California, where Rocky was born a couple of years later. By the time Rocky was diagnosed, Rusty had already built her whole worldview around one core belief, that the mind has real power over the body, that if a person can make themselves sick with worry or fear, they can also, in theory, will themselves back toward wellness. She leaned on that belief constantly throughout Rocky's life. When his headaches flared, which they did often given the pressure building inside his skull, she would send him to his room and tell him to make himself well. It's easy to read that today and wonder whether it was wisdom or denial, comfort or a kind of quiet neglect. The honest answer is that it was probably some combination, filtered through a woman who genuinely did not know another way to cope with something medicine couldn't fix. Rusty was also, without apology, a member of the Turks Motorcycle Club. This wasn't a costume or an aesthetic. It was her actual community, rough, loud, loyal people who treated Rocky like family rather than a fragile object to be pitied. The film's version of that world, and the character based on her longtime partner Benny Tullis softened a lot of the edges. The real environment around Rocky was grittier, and Rusty herself was very clear in interviews that she didn't want people mistaking her drug use for some kind of coping mechanism born purely out of despair. She said plainly, in interviews after the film came out, that she partied because partying was simply part of the lifestyle she'd always lived in, not because she was drowning and looking for an escape. Whether or not you find that framing convincing, it mattered to her that people understood the difference. By 1985, Mask was in theaters, directed by Peter Bogdanovich, starring Cher as Rusty and Eric Stoltz under heavy prosthetic makeup as Rocky. It became a genuine box office success, pulling in tens of millions of dollars. Rusty, whose life and whose dead son's story had made all of it possible, had sold the film rights for a comparatively tiny sum, reportedly around $15,000. That gap alone tells you something about how the industry works. But there's an important detail that reframes the whole transaction. Much of that money reportedly went straight toward medical bills for her oldest son, Joshua, who by the mid-1980s was seriously ill. Rusty wasn't cashing in on Rocky's memory for personal luxury. She was trying to keep her surviving child alive. When reporters came looking for a grateful, tearful reaction to the film, what they got instead was something more complicated. Rusty referred to Mask as a fairy tale. Not an insult exactly, but not a simple compliment either. In a widely cited 1986 interview with the Chicago Tribune, she explained that she had always believed telling Rocky's story could help disabled kids and their parents, some of whom, in her view, struggled with the situation more than their own children did. What she hadn't expected was how much the film would end up being about her, a stylized, dramatic version of herself, glamorized and centered in a way she hadn't anticipated when she agreed to sell the rights. At the same time, she wasn't bitter about Cher's performance. She actually praised it, saying Cher had captured her accurately, and joking that she'd always considered herself perfectly normal. It was the rest of the world that seemed a little off to her. The film also took real liberties with the timeline, compressing well over a decade of Rocky's life into what plays on screen like roughly a single year. And there was one omission that clearly bothered Rusty more than any dramatic compression. Her oldest son Joshua does not appear in Mask at all. He was written out of the story entirely, despite being a real and significant presence in the actual family. Given how much of the money from the film went toward his medical care, cutting him out of the narrative wasn't a small oversight in her eyes. There was also a quieter dispute over music. Rocky had genuinely loved Bruce Springsteen's music, and Bogdanovich built much of his original cut of the film around Springsteen songs. But the studio, Universal Pictures, couldn't finalize a licensing deal with Springsteen's label, and the soundtrack was swapped out for Bob Seger tracks without Bogdanovich's approval. Bogdanovich was furious enough to sue the studio over it, arguing it violated his contractual right to final cut. Decades later, for a 2004 director's cut release, the Springsteen songs were finally restored, 20 years after Rocky's actual life had ended. The most emotionally loaded difference between the film and reality involves the night Rocky died. In the movie, Rusty discovers her son's body herself, a gut-wrenching scene built for maximum impact. In real life, that isn't what happened. By September and October of 1978, Rocky's condition had deteriorated sharply. He was 16, in a wheelchair in his final weeks, and the headaches that had shadowed him his entire life had become unbearable. On the night of October 3rd, Rusty and a group of her biker friends held a small gathering to try to lift his spirits. Around midnight, he woke up with another headache. Rusty comforted him the way she always had, and, true to the philosophy she'd leaned on his whole life, encouraged him to rest and try to make himself well. The next morning, October 4th, 1978, Rocky died in his sleep, at home, without machines, without a hospital stay, the way he and his mother had both hoped it would happen if it ever came to that. Rusty herself was not in the house when it happened. She was at her lawyer's office dealing with a drug-related legal matter, and it was her partner who called to tell her Rocky was gone. Rocky had outlived a death sentence that was supposed to have claimed him 9 years earlier. Rusty never publicly framed her parenting philosophy as a mistake, and it would be unfair to put words in her mouth suggesting she secretly regretted it. What the record actually shows is a woman who stood by that approach until the end of her own life, who believed it had given Rocky something genuinely valuable, the ability to see himself as a person living his life, not as a patient waiting to die. Whether that mindset ever caused her to underestimate how much pain he was actually enduring those final months is a question that only the two of them could really answer, and neither of them left behind a clean, tidy resolution to it. To really understand Rusty, you also have to understand what happened to her firstborn son, Joshua, because his story explains a lot about why she made the choices she made regarding the film. Joshua Mason was Rusty's son from her first marriage, born when she was still a teenager. He grew up to become a writer living in San Francisco. In the mid-1980s, around the same time Mask was hitting theaters, Joshua was diagnosed with Kaposi sarcoma, a cancer that had become closely associated with the AIDS crisis of that era. He was openly gay, and by most accounts Rusty was supportive of him, even while occasionally voicing old-fashioned hopes about grandchildren. Joshua died in 1987, at the age of 32. Rusty had now buried both of her sons. The money from selling Rocky's story had gone, at least in significant part, toward trying to extend Joshua's life. In the end, it couldn't. She once told an interviewer that Joshua didn't believe in dying, and that she didn't either. A strange, defiant, very Rusty thing to say about two sons she had already lost or was in the process of losing. After Rocky's death, and later after Joshua's, Rusty rebuilt her life in San Francisco. She took up Buddhism. She worked as a counselor helping people struggling with drug addiction, and around the time the film came out she had plans to work with a program supporting terminally ill patients, including people living with AIDS, work that clearly connected back to what she'd lived through with her own children. She never stopped riding motorcycles. A 1986 newspaper profile described her, at 49, as a Jewish mother, former go-go dancer, ex-drug user, and vitamin product distributor, living in a spotlessly clean biker household in San Francisco's Mission District alongside a nephew and a rotating cast of biker friends. It's an almost absurd description on paper, and yet it captures her better than any single adjective could. Rusty's own life ended in a way that felt, in hindsight, oddly consistent with how she'd lived it. On October 14, 2006, she was riding her three-wheeled motorcycle when the front tire came off. She lost control, struck a curb, and was thrown into a telephone pole. She survived the initial